what have we learned so far? Well, when developers talk about client-side rendering, they're usually talking about rendering content in a browser using JavaScript, a single-page application. So instead of getting all of the content from the HTML document itself, you're getting a very tiny, small HTML document with a JavaScript file that will render the rest of the site for you on the browser. With this, we're able to have really rich interactions that make our apps feel fast. So let's talk about that. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of server-side versus client-side. As I just mentioned, one of the big things with client-side rendering is the fact that it's got very rich interactions. We're able to just load parts of the page and feel like we're working with apps instead of web pages that do a full refresh every time. They're really, really nice for these modern application-like feel that we have in our websites. Client-side rendering also has a faster response from the server. Because the server doesn't have to render the HTML page and do the render to string that React DOM server had or do any extra work, all it needs to do is just send that tiny little HTML file. The server actually responds a lot faster with client-side rendering. And finally, it's great for web applications, not just because it has rich interactions, but because it's a faster website experience after the initial load. So after the JavaScript has worked through and has created the view for us, because we already have everything loaded, unlike server-side rendering where we have to go back again to the server and make that request, all our JavaScript is loaded, all our views are there so that we're able to interact really, really fast and modify only parts of the page based on the view. And we're pretty familiar with the benefits because we work with client-side rendered applications and actually see them daily on the internet. But there are a few cons with these sort of applications. And probably the biggest one that you should consider is that with client-side rendering, it's really hard, or it's definitely more difficult to have good SEO or search engine optimization. Now, why is that? Well, because with these apps, we just render a simple HTML file. So with our React app, we just had a simple div. And the way search engine optimization works is that browsers such as Google and all these other browsers have their own crawlers or programs that search through websites, see what the websites are about, and then put them into their database to understand what they're about. So that when a user searches soup recipes, they'll know, this website's about soup, this website's about soup, this isn't about soup. I'm going to give this user these 10 results. And that's how they're able to do searches. Now, these crawlers, because they're just programs, have a difficult time working with client-side rendered apps because something like the Googlebot will load the web page and then see that this website only has a div with an ID of an app. That's it. And it's going to say, all right, it's, we might have some description that a meta tag that says, oh yeah, this web page is about robots. But when the Google bot looks at the web page, it only sees the div tag. So it says, all right, this is a bad website. I'm not interested in ranking it high for SEO. And then on top of that, we also have our app making AJAX requests to get robots. So again, the rendering takes a lot longer. So by the time Googlebot actually checks, maybe we haven't rendered everything and it won't have a good idea of what our web page does. Now, Googlebot actually waits between 5 and 20 seconds before taking what we call a snapshot of each page so that they could index it for SEO. But this doesn't always work, and this is the case only for Chrome. Like Bing or Yahoo browser or Baidu, it's a lot different. So working with these bots that crawl your website, it's really, really difficult to show them what your website's about so that you have good SEO. And this is a lot of work with client-side rendered applications, and it's very easy to have poor SEO with it. So if you have a website that really depends on SEO, let's say you're a hotel company that lists hotels all over the world, well, SEO might be important to you because you get a lot of your customers through Google searches where people say, I want a hotel in Milan. They might consider that a server-side rendered app might be better for them. And then finally, this is an obvious one that we've talked about. It's the idea that it has longer initial load. Although we get a faster response from the server, because we have JavaScript that needs to render our web page, we have a faster initial load than server-side rendered apps. So we see that loading screen or blank page a lot longer than a server-side rendered app. Initially, for most users, these types of applications will feel a lot slower. What about the other side? What about server-side rendered apps? Well, the first thing is that server-side rendered apps are really good at SEO for the points that I just mentioned, because it's rendered on the server, but the time it arrives on the browser where the Googlebot searches it, it already has everything rendered. And the Googlebot can be like, oh yeah, this is definitely a soup recipes website. I'm going to rank it high. Because the content is presented before you actually get it in the view. It's also really, really good with what we call static sites. Just simple websites that aren't as dynamic. They're websites that have a lot of text-based information, such as documentation. They're really, really good and make static sites look really nice. For example, the React documentation page is a great example of this. If we go to the documentation page for React, we see that it's mainly text. And it uses server-side rendering to render all these pages. You see how the HTML changes at the top as I switch between pages. So this is a great use case for a server-side rendered app. And then finally, another big pro is the initial page load. Because server-side rendered apps are rendered on the server, to the user, most of the time, it appears that these websites load a little bit faster. Now, what about the cons? Well, the first thing is the fact that we have to do a full page reload because we have to request a new page from the server. And you can make things fast and look nice with this, but it also is a tough one to do, especially if most of your page looks the same, but you're still requesting the same thing over and over for each different page. And then we also have slower page rendering with the G cut off over here. Oops, but I'm sure you can still see that. You see, with server-side rendering, time to first byte, which is when is the first piece of information from the server received, is slower than client-side rendering. Because as I mentioned, your server needs to spend time to create the HTML for your page instead of just sending out a fast response like with client-side rendering. Remember the React DOM server render to string method? Well, it's a synchronous CPU-bound call, which means that the CPU has to work to render your app on the server, which if it's a big app could take a long time. It holds up what we call the event loop. So the server isn't able to process any other request until this is done. And this can be a huge deal breaker for some people. If our app is really, really big and we need to render our, let's say, homepage for a really long time, that server is just going to be sitting there waiting for the server to finish its work. And this can be a huge deal breaker for most people. Server-side rendering definitely means more work for your server, but not just for the server, but for the developers as well. You're increasing the complexity of your code base as your React components now will need a Node server, just like I showed you, to be available for it to actually work. So with added complexity to your application, keep that in mind that now more of your developer time and capital and resources are going to go into getting server-side rendering to work versus working on new features or doing other things that could be more important to your app. And then obviously we have the number of requests to the server. Every time we need a new page, we need to communicate with the server. Depending on the internet connection, maybe that will actually be worse off for you than having that initial load time be longer with client-side rendering. Finally, keep in mind that server-side rendering may make your website look faster, but it doesn't actually mean a user can interact with it. Because remember, until we get that interactivity, we still need to load JavaScript. So you have to be careful with that. All right, we should have a good idea of what's good, what's bad, when to use one over the other. Let's take a look in the next video at some of the ways that you can do server-side rendering right, because we already know how to do client-side rendering. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye.